along with Rainy and Kiran. So welcome to another episode of CFI Presents. We have one of our amazing alumni here to share a little bit about her work, and I'm actually going to hand over to Aditi, who is the head of the Environmental Collaborative, and we're doing this event in collaboration with her.
So I'll just introduce Dr. Kiran. Dr. Kiran did her BA in Sociology and Anthropology from Kalamazoo College, and then her Master's and PhD in Anthropology from the University of Kentucky. Some of her areas of specialty include action research, institutional change, local governance, and community development. Today's talk she'll be focusing on some recent research that she's done regarding pollinators of fruit trees and the livelihoods in Mukteshwar. She'll focus on farmer-pollinator relationships, citizen science, participatory method, and the important and wonders of interdisciplinary research.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, everybody. I'll sort of stand and sit both. Maybe I'll see if I can sit and see everybody. Okay. Thanks for being here. That was a nice little overview of me. I was teaching at Kalamazoo College for about 30 years and recently retired. My husband Russ and I are now in kind of a fun wandering phase. But I have maintained a connection to this one research project that is in this area. And so over the course of just as a little bit of background, the sort of probably the through line of all of the different research that I've done over my career is this notion of action research. And I'll talk a little bit more specifically in detail about it in a bit. But some of the, working in Uganda related to local governance and how citizens can kind of hold their governments accountable for service delivery, working locally in Kalamazoo with folks who have serious mental illness and how their expertise as people living with illness should be sort of incorporated into the services provided. I mean, there's a huge range right there, but what sort of runs through that and a variety of other things has been this attention to doing social research for social change. And that's really been my role in this project. So this project called, we call it kind of nicely Applebee's and Livelihoods. But I'm one person in a big team of researchers, and these are just really all wonderful people. Some of you might recognize a few of the folks here who, if you have any connections with CEDAR, the Center for Eco-Development and Research in Environment Development and Research in Dehradun. So this project started when three of us, myself, Amin Luthra, who's a geographer, and Anne Fraser, who is a biologist/entomologist. We're actually working on developing some connections here with Woodstock. And through all of that, ended up connecting up with CEDAR. And through the relationship with CEDAR, who has worked in the Ramgarh/Mukteshwar Nainital area for a long time, and in conjunction with talking with some farmers in that area, we decided to try to pursue a project that looked at the interrelationship between apples, bees, and livelihoods. And you can think of each of those three really almost on a triangle, where you've got the relationship between apples and bees, you've got the relationship between bees and livelihoods, farmer livelihoods, and of course the relationship between livelihoods and apple growing. So they're looking at farmers, apple growers in this particular area. So I'll just kind of go through and I'll talk more about the team and the place as I go through, but you can feel free to interrupt anytime as well. I'm hoping this will maybe be half an hour, and then there'll be plenty of time to just talk about anything that anybody wants to talk about. This picture was, we were in Mukteshwar, in Satkol actually, and Sitla, right between those two small communities, from March 15th to March 31st. And we were all staying at this place that I forgot your name now. Jamal already knows of, called Frozen Woods, and we sort of took over that whole hotel, and this is a picture that was right from the place, from that hotel, and where we did a lot of work. You'll see a lot of pictures as we were analyzing data and dealing with bees. So this project is really being driven by a number of big issues. Climate change, obviously being one. If you're growing apples in the mountains here or in Mukteshwar, and the climate is warming, it's getting more difficult to grow apples. And so what are farmers doing? Some are switching to peaches, some are moving up, switching varieties, some are switching up to slightly higher elevations. There's a lot of dynamism right now, obviously, in sort of trying to maintain livelihoods in the time of climate change, as you all know. You've also probably heard that sort of all over the world there's a pollinator crisis, right? A crisis with pollination. Bees are suddenly dying, bees are becoming scarce. There's asynchrony between the times of bees emerge and the times that blossoms happen. Again, climate change, these are all interrelated issues. So this sort of pollination crisis. And then again, sort of livelihood insecurity. Related to both of those other things, right? So climate change is making it unpredictable if you're a farmer these days. So those are kind of big issues that are driving things. The livelihood insecurity also due to a decline in apple yields due to the pollination limitations. So farmers, when we talked to farmers in this area initially, there was a definite understanding that people were talking about the various ways the climate was changing, but there wasn't a lot of talk about what was going on with pollinators, though farmers were really interested in understanding that a little bit more deeply, and hence we decided to go ahead and do this project. The project is located in the Ramgarh block in Nainital district. In Uttarakhand. You can do some of you are familiar with it, not that far away, although it takes kind of a long time to get from here to there. But it's, as the crow flies, not that far. This is just a picture of one of the farms. There'll be several pictures thrown into this presentation. It's a gorgeous area. We were working with 15 farmers, so 15, we have a sample of 15 farms at this point. And they range in altitude from 1,800 meters to about 2,200 meters. So we're really kind of interested in looking at that variation and how sort of the health of pollinators varies, but also the viability of apple production and that's the kinds of decisions farmers are making about the crops that they're growing at those different altitudes. Apples, as you maybe know, why apples? Apples have been grown in this area for a long time in Uttarakhand, here in Garhwal as well. Frederick Wilson, who most of you know of, right? Sort of rope bees connected to him, and all, he had huge influence here. But he introduced apples in this area. Apples are also grown a lot in Himachal Pradesh, as you also might know. There they were actually introduced by a different person, George Stokes. And one of the questions one of my colleagues is really interested in, this is a different project, but is how the sort of nature of apple production in Himachal and in Uttarakhand, which is quite different in terms of how farmers are organized or not, how that actually might be even connected all the way back to those two different people that introduced apples into the two different areas. But apples have a long history of being grown way over 100 years. Uttarakhand is also, the government has made apples a priority crop. So that was another reason for focusing on apples in this project. But there has been very little focus on pollinators in this area. Okay. So the overarching goal of this project, so let me just say that what we just have been doing up until this point, since 2018, I think you could probably characterize it as the exploratory part of a much bigger research project. So we've had 3 different whole team field visits to this area where we've been working with farmers, conducting surveys, and as I'll show this time, doing a couple of different experiments or data collection activities, trying to assess understand the diversity and abundance of pollinators in this area. But ultimately, this is part of a much bigger research project that would be a multi-year project, and we're in the process of submitting, we have submitted one proposal to the National Science Foundation in the US. You usually have to submit a few before you actually get funding. The proposal was reviewed quite highly, but one of the things they were really interested in trying to find out was, okay, is there actually a problem? Right? Can you demonstrate that there's actually a problem before we actually fund this whole project? So really this work that we've been doing now is really geared to that, right? So it's sort of establishing, yep, there is a problem, yep, farmers really do want to work on this as well. So that's kind of where we are. It's that initial exploratory phase. So I'm just going to be talking about a slice of that rather than going into the whole theoretical framework overarching the whole big project. Although I happen to talk about that later if you want. So we're in the early stages. But the overarching goal would be, is to enhance the resilience of both pollinators and farmers in a time of climate uncertainty. And so what does that mean? What do we mean? What does that mean to say enhance the resilience of pollinators and farmers? Well, a resilient pollinator community would be diverse in terms of species and numerically abundant, right? So just as you talk about crop diversity or having a diversified income or anything like that, you sort of can use that same concept in thinking about pollinators. You'd want to have a pollinator community that's diverse. It has a number of different kinds of pollinators. And here we're talking mostly about bees. We're not really focusing on butterflies and things. But so we have a diverse pollinator community, and there's a lot of them. Okay, that would be one measure. And then another is that farmers have a diverse array of strategies, action-tested strategies, actually, to maintain pollinator health. Okay, so to maintain that kind of diverse and abundant pollinator community. So those would be what the overarching goal we're aiming towards. And even this part of the project is got bits of moving in that direction, we hope. So, one of the things that I've said for a while, and that I kind of make as a criteria of projects that I'm going to engage in, is that I want to do work on interesting things with people I like. So, and almost all of my work has been collaborative research. I've done very little. I think probably it goes all the way back to my dissertation, and even then, my husband Russ was with me. Maybe it wasn't even individual research at that point, because he's an anthropologist as well, and we collaborated with each other on our two different dissertation PhD research projects. So I always have worked with others in a collaborative way for research. I think it's a much more fun, and I think it's much more interesting. And I particularly, I guess, except for the example of our own PhD research, but it's always been in interdisciplinary teams. So I don't think any of my research has actually been centered with other anthropologists. I've worked with scholars of religion. I worked for a long time on land use projects with a colleague who was an economist. And this project has, I even have to look at it to make sure I get it. It has geographers, forest ecologists, anthropologists, 2 entomologists, specialists in horticulture, botanists, a landscape ecologist, and somebody who's focused on GIS. So that group of people, this was a fun pizza night thing we did. But there's a couple people missing here who left. Vishal Singh and Anvita Pandey had left. But that's the team. And we have a blast together. And they're amazing people. And when you work interdisciplinary, there's just so much learning that goes on. So when I start talking about this project, and I'm an anthropologist, I don't usually deal with trying to identify bees. But it's awesome to be on a team where we're all working on everything, and so you learn a whole bunch. And so it's interdisciplinary, it's international. We come from primarily US and India, and it's multi-institutional. There's Kalamazoo College, George Washington University, Cornell University, Cedar here, and Flame University, which is based in Pune. So we represent all of those universities. And so when we all can finally get together, mostly in the field, we have a good time, and we work amazingly well together. And the first time we actually all worked together, Vishal Singh, who's the executive director of CEDAR, decided to do a little values exercise among us. We were just getting to know each other of sort of what would we prioritize, and sort of in working together, what would be an example of successful kind of relationship across these different institutions. And we found we were all very similar and all clicked and decided, all right, well, we're going to do a project together. And even though the pandemic happened and things, took a big pause, as they did in many other ways, that getting all back together again and kind of keeping this project going, even though it takes a little bit of time, is something we're all pretty committed to. So we were based at, some of these pictures here are at Frozen Woods. This one, it was very cold, you can see down here. This was, you might remember here, mid-March. It was cold and it was rainy. And so this is inside the main, we'd be out in the field doing stuff, and then we'd be inside dealing with the various pollinators that we had collected. Or the farmers had collected. We had 2 people who had their babies with us, a mother-in-law, a husband. So we were quite family friendly as well. So the methods I mentioned at Action Research, this is really my main role in the project, was to keep us focused in this kind of methodology, where the sort of how you do things is I would say, as important as the what. So Action Research is a democratic kind of research where researchers and farmers are understood to both have expertise, where the success of a project is determined more by the sort of change or movement towards self-determination that results, rather than necessarily just publications or speaking to one's own academic community, and also where knowledge is co-generated. So one understands that in doing this work, you're sort of learning the researchers and the farmers. So the farmers are also researchers, and that there's a lot of collaboration and co-generation of knowledge in the process. I could go on and on. I've written a number of things about Action Research, so I'm just going to stop there. But it's a really kind of a mutual, grounded, and I guess in a form of mutuality between the researcher and there's not even good words for it. So you don't want to, the researcher and the other people involved in the research. It's also grounded in citizen science. And so some of you might have any of you used, for example, iNaturalist, right? Okay, so iNaturalist is a form of citizen science, right? Where you can use it to identify things, but then you can upload the data and what you found into this broader database that some other experts up there, right, in the cloud or really over in wherever they are, collect all of this data, and it helps to understand, so a lot of stuff about biodiversity and across the world. But a lot of citizen science, that type even, like iNaturalist, is what you might call contributive, right? The role of the citizen scientist is really just to collect that data and upload it. And the citizen scientist isn't actually involved in the analysis of the data so much, right? They don't sort of get the results back from the data. They're not involved in sort of generating research questions about the data, right? They're just gathering the data and putting it in there. So you can contrast that a little bit with a collaborative citizen science. So what would collaborative citizen science look like that would be different? And that would be a citizen science where the people who are collecting the data, the citizen scientists who are collecting the data, are involved really a little bit more in the end-to-end part of the research. Now that would be an ideal to strive for, where they're involved actually in generating the questions to be asked, right? In how that data is going to be collected, in what the data collected means, and then what to do about that. So that's quite different than just the little bit in the middle there that's just collecting the data and putting it up in there. We're trying to anchor our project in more of this collaborative citizen science, where the farmers are involved sort of Not sure if it's all the way from research question, a little bit, the topic I would say, but in terms of like providing data back, as you'll see, thinking with the farmers about what this means, what does this mean about practices, et cetera. So it's not just, you collect the data for us, thank you. Maybe thank you, right? But actually collaborative. So that's a little bit about, if that makes sense, of that, the kind of action research, the sort of methodology that we're working on. So I talk more about that slide because that's probably my angle. So the questions guarding this particular stage of the project, I've kind of alluded to this already, are two. How does pollinator diversity and abundance vary by altitude and season? And to what extent are pollinators limiting apple yield and quality? And again, this is what we're asking right now, because this is kind of, we need to establish this, right? We need to know if, or sort of how this diversity and abundance varies, and if indeed there is an issue with pollinators affecting apple yield and apple quality. So I'm going to talk about two different activities that we did. Okay, I'll start here. So we did two different things. The first question about trying to understand pollinator diversity and abundance was we did through bee bowl sampling. So bee bowl sampling, and this is, farmers were collaborating with this. They were working with us all the way along. So bee bowl sampling involves a process, this over here, I actually don't speak Hindi, this was not, only a tiny, tiny bit. But all the materials that we work with farmers are translated into Hindi and tried to be made obviously as useful as they can. So we distributed, this is a little bit of a chunk from what we call the farmer diary. And this is, I just took this out so you can see kind of what the deal is with bee bowls. So there are these bowls that are painted specific colors that bees or pollinators would be attracted to. And they are filled with some water with a little bit of dish soap. And they're placed in the orchards about 5 meters apart for about 20 meters. And these, the idea here is that those will attract pollinators, and also other things I'll get to, but that will fly into the air and obviously drown. So there's a little bit of killing, but it's not very much. So we asked farmers to set out bee bowls 5 times, starting February 15th, March 1st, March 15th, April 1st, and April 15th. And they would set out the bowls. So they'd set out 3 bowls of each color. And you'd have to set those out in the morning. And then in the afternoon, later after the sun goes out, on a sunny day, bees only like to come out when it's sunny. So you'd collect them back up again. And when you collect them, you take all the white bowls and you pour them into one of these bags that then gets sealed up, the yellow bowls into a bag, and the blue bowls into a bag. And they were given labels. So the first time, the first round, we would have one, and there'd be a 1 blue, 1 yellow, 1 white, right? So this was, when we arrived in the field, this was a visit to one of the farms. Ankita was working with one of the farmers on what he'd written down in the farmer diary. And this is Aman and Renu, and these were 3 rounds of samples, of bee bowl samples, that had been collected at that point. So we were picking them up. So there you can kind of see, we were all of these bags with little tags in them, whatever was caught in those bee bowls. We take those back to Frozen Woods, to the hotel, and then we would need to figure out to identify these, which was quite the process. New to me, but it was really totally fun to do as a group. Anne Fraser, a colleague of mine at Kalamazoo College, one of the 2 entomologists, so you'd actually have to strain those bags into, through a strainer into a jar, rinse them off with water, and then use a blow dryer to actually dry them. At that point, as she would say, the little hairs would get all fluffed up. And she would put them in these different bowls, she and Preeti, was the other entomologist. And she taught us how to pin them in boxes. And what you see over there on the right is all of the bees that were collected from Farm A. So we have 15 farms, so Farm A was actually one of the farms. And by the time we pin them, and then the two entomologists would go through and identify them, and in the end, you would know, a lot of what was collected in those bowls was little flies, so they would have to pick all of those out. But this ends up being what was collected in Farm A white cup, you can see, for the first, in the first round, Farm A, blue cup, etc. So those can be then, you'll sort of see a report that comes a little bit later on, but there's many different kinds of bees, right? So we're most familiar with honeybees, right? There's Apis mellifera, which is the European honeybee, and Apis cerana indica is the local species of honeybee. But there's many other kinds of bees. And so this includes all of those different ones that were collected. And as you'll see in a minute, a couple slides later, we give a report back to farmers of sort of what was found on their farms and how many and at what particular time. So this is obviously then both diversity and abundance, right? What kinds of, and this varied. Some farms had very few. There was one farm that actually had 3 boxes worth of bees. So it did vary. The total analysis of why and how is still going on right now. We've just kind of got to this stage a couple of weeks ago. And so the entomologists will be sort of doing more data analysis to figure out sort of exactly what do we see in the trends collectively. But this is kind of as far, we were able to get this far actually in the field. And that was the way of determining the diversity and abundance. I think this is something that could be done with students. I mean, if I could do it, then I'd never pinned a bee before, right, or done anything. You need the expert who can identify them. But that was and the farmers were involved along the way and are getting the information back. The other activity that we did to figure out whether there was some limit, the pollinators were limiting apple yields, was called a Pollinator Exclusion experiment. And this one, Rachel would probably kill me for showing that picture, but I really like it anyway. So we all were out in again, these 15 farms. So what we did is we did 5 different treatments on 5 inflorescences. So an inflorescence is the group of blossoms that emerge on an apple tree. So when you see blossoms, it's not just one blossom. There's usually a group of 5 or 6 blossoms in a cluster, right? So a cluster of blossoms. So we would do 5 different treatments on 5 inflorescences per tree, 10 trees per orchard. Okay, so there was a lot of them, a lot of treatments. And the treatments, so here's this good kind of experiment. The treatments were, on one cluster, you would put a bag over it and totally exclude it. Not like this was done before the flowers emerged, so no pollination had happened yet by bees. So you'd put the bag over the cluster, and it was going to stay that way. Actually, we did 2 of those. Those were like control groups. Okay, so 2 would be totally excluded from any kind of pollination. 1 inflorescence would be open. We wouldn't do anything to it. We'd leave it open. 1 would be open, but then we went back and hand pollinated. Okay, so in addition to letting it be open and let pollinators get to it, we would also hand pollinate it. And another one would be excluded. The bag would be on it, but we would open it up long enough to hand pollinate it. Okay, so 2 excluded, 1 open with hand pollination, and 1 excluded with hand pollination. And the idea here is that, so then that was what we did that while we were there. Now those are all sitting there like that. So you can see what you have are some of the bags that are on the inflorescence, the 3 that have bags, and the yellow ribbons are labeling which treatment it is. Okay, so that's going to stay like that, and in a couple of weeks, Aman, who's in the blue shirt, and Renu, actually here, are going to go back, and they're going to actually count the fruit set. So they'll figure out how many fruits we're going to be developing in each of those treatments, right? And then later, they'll go back again, and actually look at the size of the fruit, the weight and size of the fruit, to try to get a little bit of a handle on. We decided not to go all the way to amount of sugar and all of that, but to get a sense of the quality. Okay, so you want to get both yield and quality. So that's kind of what we did there. That was that other, the second experiment, and we see down in the bottom corner here, this is Preeti, and Preeti and Anne were the 2 entomologists, as I mentioned, and they were the ones that were doing most of that hand pollinating. It was a little bit more precision kind of work to know exactly what to do with that. But one of the cool things that started to happen as we were doing this, and this one, it really wasn't designed that much initially to think about a lot of collaboration with farmers, but I think because the farmers had been working with us on the bee bowls and had been consulting kind of all the way through, they were totally engaged. I don't think there was an expectation that they'd be down there in the field and picking out which set of inflorescences to choose and looking at the pollen and adding to the labeling. And so this middle one is Aman, and this is the daughter. She's probably 11th grade 11 maybe, and she was like, I'm helping, and learning along the way, and so everybody's kind of learning in this process as we're going, and of course different kinds of things happen, and one of the things you might say is, okay, obviously you have to plan this 2-week trip a long time in advance, right? How do you know you're going to be there when the apple blossoms are going to happen? I mean, that could be any time. So kind of a funny story is we thought, it's never really going to work. Really, what's the chances we get there at apple blossom time? So we actually asked the farmers to start growing mustard, because mustard plants are another one where you could do the same kind of experiment. So we actually, this is how unagricultural everybody was on the team, had people start growing mustard at the beginning of February. So we get to the farms in the middle of March, and these mustard plants are barely grown. And thank goodness the apple trees were blossoming. So all this mustard that they were growing might eventually grow and they can make some sod. But we were super fortunate that we got there actually at the sweet spot of because the mustard plant thing was a dud. So we were really fortunate. But there were some trees and some varieties. So when we did this work, we also had to record. I was often the recorder. We'd record the variety of the tree, obviously which farm it was, how many buds actually were in that inflorescence, because not every inflorescence has 5 blossoms. Some have 4, some have 5, some have 6, right? And you got to know that in order to know actually what ends up happening in the end. So you had to record a number of things about each of the trees, but sometimes we get to a farm and actually, especially when we came to the hand pollinating time, the buds just hadn't opened. So you really couldn't hand pollinate yet. But sometimes some of the other ones that we had bagged, for example, were open and we could do a little bit of switcherooing. But at any time you're doing any kind of field work like this, as many of you know already, you just got to be flexible and you got to be ready to switch gears and try something else because you don't quite know what's actually going to happen. But we were pretty lucky in the way things worked out. Just as moving towards the end here, the co-generating and sharing knowledge piece that I was talking about as being pretty central to action research. There was a few ways that we've done that just in this first little bit. We do have this farmer diary that was distributed at the beginning where, to farmers, where they were going to be recording a lot of things. When they put pesticides, as you can imagine, when you put pesticides on your apple trees, and you kind of have to put pesticides on your apple trees unless you're going to super commit to organic farming. When that happens, related to blossom time, right, is going to have a lot to do with what happens to the pollinators. So when trees are fertilized, when the blossoms are emerging, all kinds of different information. It also contained the instructions for the bee bowls and things like that. So that was kind of a data collection. We also, this is just a couple pictures of working with the farmers. We did some informal interviews also with the farmers to try to get that sort of quote unquote local knowledge, like how are farmers actually thinking about pollinators? And we did that with some farmers in this project and some out to try to get a sense already of is there ways that participating in this project is actually already shaping people's thinking about pollinators, which it does seem to be. And then over here, this has been translated into Hindi, but I'm including here the English version, is a report that we're just now preparing for each of the farmers on what was found in terms of the bee bowls on their farms. And so there's a few things that are kind of cool about this, I think. One is it actually shows, like here's the bees that were collected. But this other, this part up here, it has, again, people don't really know what all the different pollinators are. And so this is actually all those different kinds of bees, right? And then how many were found on all of the farms together, and then how many on their farm. And out of this, we debated whether to put some recommendations on what people could do to increase pollinators, but there's still 2 more rounds of bee bowls to be collected, right? So we're not really quite done. So instead decided to just kind of give them an example of what to expect from here on in. One of the interesting things about preparing this is thinking about how do you prepare something that can be readily kind of understood, right? So we had a lot of talk about including graphs, which is a certain kind of like symbolic representation of data. I mean, I taught briefly quantitative methods to students at Kalamazoo College and just try to get them to understand what a bar graph is, right, was a trick. So, thinking what is the right way to do this? And so initially this data about the bees was all in some complex double pie chart, and our more quantitatively oriented colleagues is like, no, right? That's just not gonna work. People aren't gonna understand anything about this, right? So, and there was a lot more text than even this on the thing. So we had a lot of interesting back and forth about if you're gonna be collaborative and be about sharing knowledge, you can't just share the knowledge in some kind of academic way, right? In fact, one of the people responded to an early draft of the report. So just save that in case we were going to give a poster presentation at an academic conference, right? It's like, this is not going to be the form. So we're not quite sure this is even actually right, but it's part of that thinking of how do you do this in a way that's going to make sense and make it usable and understandable to farmers. So that's where Amin right now is actually in the process of preparing those reports. And when he and Renu go back into the field in a couple of weeks to count those fruit sets, they'll be giving those reports back to the farmers and spending a little time talking through them and what it looks like is happening on their farms. But ultimately, there can be a lot of different possible ways of increasing pollinator health that we're thinking of. I mean, you can increase the number of floral resources. Aren't I sounding a little bit more like a botanist than an anthropologist? I've learned some terminology, right? Some floral resources for the pollinators. And one of the things that Preeti mentioned is if you just put the pesticides in the evening instead of in the daytime, you actually might not be killing the bees, right? Because they only come out during the daytime. So that was kind of so some of the things aren't that tricky, but very few of them use the wall hives and things like that in houses, but very few, only 2 of the 15 farmers had any kind of managed hives. Nobody had wall hives in their houses because those just the newer houses that just don't have them. And only 2 had ever used bee boxes, like hired boxes of bees, right, where people come in here during, apple blossom time will use some boxes of bees. So very few were using any kind of managed hives. They were relying mostly on wild pollinators in the process. So it really is a lot about thinking. And there's a lot of interesting stuff about using those bee boxes, and especially many of them are the European honeybee. And in the United States, there's a lot of interesting things going on about that's actually creating a huge problem, because those imported non-indigenous bees are just overtaking the environment, and the indigenous bees are getting all squeezed out. And so it's really reducing diversity. And so, the idea there's some, increasing the habitats and the health of the indigenous bee community is actually probably a better way to go. And the farmers seem to understand that, actually. They're not too interested in those European boxes. They've participated in a couple of different NGO efforts to distribute those, and they said, oh, well, they come and they give us these bees, but they just die. Because during the winter time, they're not going to be maintaining these bees. Right? It's not for honey, this is for like maintaining pollinators for the fruit orchards. So you got to really put a lot of work into maintaining those all year round, especially in the winter. So we'll see where that all ends up going. So that's kind of the end. I guess I've kind of alluded, I think, to some of these wonders, and I think the really importance of interdisciplinary research. I mentioned that's the kind of work that I do. I think it's absolutely essential, as I'm sure most of you do, to trying to address the big issues facing the world today. We just need this multi-layered kind of knowledge and people with different expertises and ways of seeing and kinds of questions they ask all working together. And I think that's for me, one of the biggest joys of working in that kind of environment is moving around in the world with my entomologist colleagues who are just seeing these bugs, right, that I would not see. Right? And I'm seeing things going on, social kind of dynamics going on in houses and in communities that they don't see, right? And they're not, but when you sort of put it all together in, stereo, well, that's only two, you need many more, right? You just get such an interesting, I see things that I never would have seen if I'm attentive to things I never would have been attentive to if I hadn't been working. And going to school and learning all of this does that too, but then there's something about working on a project together, right, where you're like moving around in these spaces with people who are just seeing the world through different lenses is really kind of wondrous. That's kind of the thing that drives me the most. So I would be interested in thinking, and I know part of what was said about this talk was that it might connect with the biodiversity survey, so I'd be interested in whether there's any connections there, but also just any other questions or thoughts. Again, this is early stages of the project, ideas, right? I'm totally open, so that's that. Yeah.
First of all, I know it's easier said than done, but it's obviously the pesticides that are killing off a lot of the bees.
Yeah.
And apple is a monoculture, isn't it? What if they intercrop?
So most of these farms are very intercropped. So we're not working with the big ones, that are just growing the apples and hortitourism and things like that. So mostly when we were tromping around in these orchards, we had to be careful not to be stepping on the peas and the potatoes, and over here were the apricots, and there were the peaches, and here, So there was a lot of other stuff being planted. But one of the things that was interesting, again, that I learned from Anne was when you intercrop under the trees, so many of these bees are ground bees, and they go down into the soil. And so one of the questions was, well, how far down do they go? And some only go about 10 inches. And if some go further down to make their hives, nests, whatever. So, but then a tilling of the land under the apple trees actually disturbs those, which is kind of interesting, right? So but maybe the ones that are making their hives deeper into the soil can still manage the tilling. So even the intercropping under the trees can have some potential impact. But yeah, the pesticides, I think, and everybody was talking about that. is a huge problem. And, you know, one of the things, kind of like organic farming too, but if one of the bigger theoretical questions that's kind of overarching the project is to think about pollinators as the commons, right? To think about, just as you might have grazing lands as commons, right? Or sometimes like irrigation systems as commons. And if you think about the pollinators as the commons, what is it, you know, if somebody, the pollinators have about what is it, maybe 1,500 meter, 2,500 meter kind of range. But that varies a little bit when you put altitude in the mix, you know? So, but if just the neighboring farm is using pesticides, those bees aren't just staying on this farm, right? So it's sort of the same issue with organic farming. But you know, what kind of cooperatives or collaboratives could potentially exist? And this is one of the questions that was being asked in the informal interviews with the farmers is, you know, trying to, I'm not sure how it ended up being asked in Hindi, but like thinking about the pollinators as kind of commons or coming together to somehow protect that environment or enhance the environment. But you know, it's really hard if they don't put pesticides. I mean, there's these worms that get in there, and if you move to organic, what is it, like 5 years or something? It takes a long time, yeah. And you can't really do it if your neighboring farm is just like, so with organic farming, it's really hard. But pesticides is big.
What about letting some of the weeds grow? Because not all weeds are bad.
Right. So those are all things to kind of put in the mix and like to think about with farmers. And the farmers are helpful in thinking about, okay, that can work, but no, it can't, or yes, it could under these. But that was what I thought was interesting of the notion of just the pesticides at night, right, or in the evening when the bees aren't out and about. You know, now, they still probably sticks on the blossoms and, right, but it would help.
There's still poison on the blossoms.
It's still poison on the blossoms, but it might diminish, it might not be as bad, right, kind of thing. So is there a way that it's hard to think of whether there's here's 100% fix, but if that environment can be enhanced or the practices can be changed in a way that's moves it a little further. There's something potentially there. But I think you hear them all talk about pesticides and the built environment, right? That there's more roads, there's more houses. The houses don't have the hives in them, right? The wall hives. There's just not as much land. The landscape ecologist on the team is doing a lot with satellite imagery to really look to sort of correlate she will be correlating some of this data on the diversity and abundance of bees with the proximity to forests. So how far are these orchards from nearby forests or just unused land, right? That's weedy, right? Or has whatever kind of on it. And so how proximate are these orchards to those kinds of areas to address that kind of question. And whether we see some differences in the diversity and abundance of bees with what's nearby. And so she's taking, I can't remember exactly how many meters she was looking at kind of around the orchard. And then they were all focused on, you know, making these maps and polygons and things. It was kind of little glimpses into that particular world, but, you know, and characterizing them by different things, and then they'll analyze that and add it into the mix. Of course, a big thing when you're doing something like this is how do you pull all of these different kinds of data together ultimately in the end, but that's more the challenge of Amen, the lead guy, than me. Anything else? Yeah.
So that's one systematic complication of this interdisciplinary research, but I'm also thinking about it from the funding perspective. So you said that what you did now was kind of a preliminary before going after funding. So I may have missed it, but was this all of the separate institutions deciding that they would each fund the researchers?
No, so we actually, when the three of us who were at that point at Kalamazoo College, so Kalamazoo College is a member of a consortium of small colleges in the Midwest, in the US, and they were giving funding for actually interdisciplinary and interinstitutional research, and they wanted, so FLAME one of the university that's in Pune, is a member of the Global Liberal Arts Alliance, and they were really interested in connecting our consortium to sort of budding liberal arts institutions in other parts of the world. And so if you could have collaboration between those, that upped your chances of getting one of these grants. So we got one of those grants, and that has funded the three trips, plus Aman now has money from George Washington University that helped with this one. So we actually, the CEDAR team wasn't pitching in money, they were actually getting, being there per diem and things like that were getting paid out of that grant because they didn't have grant money for it. And then the others of us were supported directly from that other grant.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Wondering if that was a hurdle or a help, and it sounds like there are things that are a help to that interdisciplinary research.
Yeah, it can be. Right, it can be. But you're right. It also can be really difficult for trying to find those big grants, which are very discipline focused. And so it's been a challenge. I think this National Science Foundation is the best bet. Others are just really focused on. The other thing is it's often difficult to get funding. It's more difficult to get funding for these more kind of change-oriented projects, right? These sort of more action research projects, more applied kind of projects. But it does have, a bigger theoretical piece to it, but that can also be a challenge. There's a big bias towards more conventional kind of research in that funding, research funding world, and it doesn't really fit into the kind of funding that's available for NGOs particularly. It's not that kind of project. So it is there's a niche for it, but it's a tricky one to identify and then actually get. But we're pretty optimistic now.
Just curious to know what's the intention of doing that bee ball sampling with the frequency of 2 weeks for 4 times?
So that's to get at a bit of that seasonality. And so the February 15th is really before many flowers have bloomed at all, right? So in the mountains there, it was still winterish, right? And then so the February 15th, or March 1st, March 15th is covering that time, March 30th, or April 1st, April 15th, where there's a real different sets of things blooming. Right, so different floral resources, different resources available to these different pollinators, as well as it covers different times that those pollinators are around, the different species, right? And so that's the seasonality, and also how that seasonality of the pollinators varies by altitude. So that farm, one farm that had 3 boxes full of identified bees, that was a farm that was located actually in one of the lower altitudes and near a river, and had kind of a more wide open, actually I think it might have been the one that I had the picture of early on actually, that one. Where it sort of has a lot of kind of a little bit more flatter land, it's closer to a river, there's some woods around it. So that one, it wasn't exactly this farm, but it was in this area. We had this huge number of pollinators. So trying to understand where you have all of the, more and less and all of this floral resources and things.
So you collect the bowl of the bee and then check the different samples of pollinators?
Correct. So the bees, the bowls, let's just say the yellow bowls, right? So you have yellow, white, and blue, and at one time there would be 3 of each color. So you'd take all the yellow bowls and you'd strain them and put them into this one bag with some alcohol. This is rubbing alcohol kind of stuff. I can't remember what you call it, but anyway, and that's a sample, and it would be from the round 1 yellow bowl. And then you take all the blue bowls and you put those into one. And then those are the ones that we then brought back and processed and then pinned so that you could see all the ones from all the bees that came in from the white cup in the first sample are on that top row. Those were all the pollinators that were found. But if you were to look at a different farm, you might have 3. right? So this one actually was a pretty decent amount. And so in the, I didn't talk about the vein traps, but that's a different kind of trap that we tried, and you can see that it's like a big kind of trap, and it got like a bumblebee, right? You can see the big bumblebee, right? But the blue cup then is that third line. And then you have the second sample, farm A white cup. Somewhere in there's the yellow, farm A yellow cup. So you had, what I noticed that the yellow cups actually got a lot more, it seemed like consistently, but who knows why. But the cups are painted with a certain kind of paint that have some sort of fluorescent attraction to the pollinators, yeah. So when you look at those, the data that is entered, has been entered, and those little teeny labels have the species, all the information that's necessary, including not species level, actually, it's genus level, that are, and it includes those 16 types or whatever that was on that last page. Lasioglossum and Halictus and all of these.
On top of biodiversity, I'm also thinking about the kind of employment that we provide for manual pollination, the wage workers. Yes, so it's a conflict between hiring them versus going through beekeeping and pollinations.
Yeah, so normally you really I mean, the hand pollination isn't something that's being done or necessary now. Although we were reading about in China, there's been so many of the bees in some areas have been killed that all trees have to be completely hand pollinated, which is like, sounds amazing. Like that is a ton of work. But here there's still plenty of these different kinds of pollinators that are doing the work. They're not, maybe not plenty, but they are being pollinated, right?
Question. In one of your earlier slides, you mentioned that you were looking at the variety and also the abundance.
Yep.
So variety I do understand because you're using this bee bowl sampling. For abundance, did you use some kind of indices, or how did you find out?
So right now, that's still, that one, for this part, is also the bee bowls, because what you might, I don't know if you could, it can't quite zoom all the way in, but like this whole bit actually might be all Lasioglossum bees, right? And a couple of Apis, I'm not sure if that's what that is really, but those could be a couple of Apis indica, or there was syrphid flies that would be included as well. So this actually has the abundance as well, because in those samples, right, in that sample you had this many of these kinds. And so that is getting at both of those through just that one kind of sampling. Down the road, some interesting, things that we've talked about, and this is what I was thinking about with biodiversity. We were talking about it just a little bit, but we were thinking of it would be pretty cool if you could even involve like school children or school-age kids in taking pictures of bees on flowers as they're walking home from school, right? And iNaturalist, as that citizen science app, you could set up a project in that, right? And you could actually have kids just uploading these pictures. It's not all experimentally designed, but it still would be a really interesting way for any kind of bugs on a flower, right? Because a lot of these little things, these little ones, they are tiny, tiny. I would never have known that they were actually a bee. They just look like little flies or something to me. I would not have known those were actually in this same category. So anything that is on the flower, then you can get rid of the flies and things like that in the project, I suppose. But I think there's some interesting ways to think about really in involving communities and in collecting that kind of data. And people pretty much have smartphones these days, and the iNaturalist app is free, and who knows. But that's something we were kind of thinking about.
The topic was generating livelihood. So we all know that apple production has been really affected, and climate change is a very important factor to that. So here in the discussion we have mentioned about many bees
Mm-hmm.
which may or may not produce honey. So how that entire, like how the revenue, how the livelihood is generated. Like there's a particular species of bee only which generates
Mixed honey, right?
And the apple production is also there. But there are various other factors like the climate change is a very important thing. Moreover, the rural population in the villages, they were migrating to the
Yes,
big cities.
exactly.
So how to, like, I was just wondering, like,
Right.
how to bring them back to, so that they put their time in apple culture, like they do the farming with this pollinator diversity, like how to do that?
So yeah, it's a great observation that sort of this particular chunk of the project doesn't seem like it's super livelihood centered, and so it's mostly because that part wasn't so much questioned in the review of the proposal as much as establishing this deal about pollinators. But the livelihood here related with pollinators and the apples is more about the viability of apples, right, and having high yielding and good quality apples, and that's pollinator dependent. So that's kind of the livelihood. It's the livelihood of apple growers, not so much using bees and honey as livelihood, right? So it's still the focus, the livelihood focused is on apple growing. And so these are all apple farmers, right? And the point here is like to maintain or sort of enhance the viability and even maybe a little bit of the kind of predictability, right, of farming, right? If you can have this diversity and abundance of pollinators and you have these sets of strategies, that resilience notion, if you have those sets of strategies, oops, I lost it. But you have a set of strategies that work for like maintaining pollinator health, right? And it's not pollinator health, for the farmer's perspective, it's not pollinator health for pollinator health. It's not pollinator health because we all love bees, right? It's pollinator health because I'm an apple grower, right? And I really need to make my livelihood from apples, as well as some other things. But I mean, I need to know that my apples are going to be good apples, right? And I'm going to have enough apples. And perhaps, I mean, the outflow of labor is absolutely happening. And just like in a lot of places, those farmers, that land, as more people are moving to that area, they can work remotely, right? It's beautiful, right? People are moving from the cities, they're buying up land, as is happening here, right? They're buying up land in this area. Farmers are having a choice, right? Their kids are leaving to go make their living in other places. Do I sell, right? Can I make a living farming, or do I sell to this, my land is increasing in value because all these people are coming and they want it, and it's beautiful there, and you can have your apple trees, and that's a happy tourist thing, right? So, you know, there is something about maintaining the viability of that kind of livelihood. I mean, farmers have to want to do that, right? But maybe it's a little bit more attractive if it's, you know, I mean, most of these farmers, they don't want to give up farming, right? So.
Sorry. So, are we into organic farming, like you mentioned, the pesticides? So is it organic, like because various other factors, like the soil factors, the farming
Right.
methods, and so many factors add to the viability of that particular.
Right.
So like whether the clusters were chosen for the particular sampling, like when it was sampled, was the if studies were done for the, because to study the viability there are various other factors.
Yeah. So we did another one in one of the previous trips that we did, and we were talking with the farmers. We were also doing an interview and trying to understand the farming practices, like the kind of fertilizers that they're using. So Shweta, who's at Flame, is a soil scientist. And so she's particularly kind of has that angle. And sort of what kinds of fertilizers were being used. Were they chemical, or was it compost, or some combination? When were they being applied? The same with, you know, other kinds of treatments. So we looked at that, but none of these were our organic farmers. And again, I suppose if many of them could just like fly right past that 5-year period where you have to kind of just wait till you could actually claim it, and you're going to go with, I mean, we met somebody another farmer that we kind of came across who wasn't in this sample, who came and had dinner with us at Frozen Woods, and we were talking with him, and he had to go 5 years and just make it through that period of like pretty crappy apples, right, before the sort of benefits of being an organic farmer came in. And now he's there, and it's working, and he's really happy with it, and he's super committed to it. But he said, yeah, you know, you kind of have to make it 5 years, and you know, that's who's got the ability to absorb that kind of risk and that kind of gap or drop in income, or you got to have something else going on if you to be able to do that. So it's, I bet farmers would love it if they could do it without, because it would be obviously cheaper too, right? You don't have to buy all the pesticides, and you're not applying these poisons, and I don't think anybody really wants to be doing that, but that's the only way to make sure you're going to get some apples, you know, and they're not going to be all spotted, because, you know, they've got to sell these apples, and the Himachal apples are like the gold standard. So these Uttarakhand apples already have a reputation of not being as good as the Himachal apples. There's all kinds of interesting dynamic there. So, you know.
It's very expensive for a farmer to switch to organic.
Really, it is.
Once you are, and then the yield is less.
Right.
Also.
And you can only go by the, yeah.
In Himachal, let me tell you, they spray like anything.
Yeah.
We spray a lot of pesticides.
Yeah. And they have, you know, they've got the reputation of the good apples and the Uttarakhand farmers. There's interesting stories around. There's this one variety called a DK variety that everybody's growing because it produces fast. You can buy the sapling, and with very few years you'll have your apples. And they look great. They're like a deep red color. They taste terrible, right? But they look really good, and they have a long shelf life. And so for a while they were able to get pretty good money, and then like the folks got kind of onto this, right? And that these were like these Uttarakhand apples, and these are terrible apples. And now they're having to really suffer from the reputation of but they're still growing some of the DK apples, that variety.
Based on what we can do with the schools, I'm more focused on like what we can do with the kids here as well.
Yeah.
You know, there is a concept which I have been in some civil society organization in UK. What they're trying is they're setting bee hotels, which is very
Oh, yeah.
concept.
Right.
That way we can have diversity at one place without killing it.
Yeah.
The kids can set up these hotels everywhere around the campus as well. You know?
Yep.
So, because not every bee is going to live in a hive.
Right.
Most of the bees live like aloners.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Just the honeybees. I mean, a lot of them are they're solitary bees. So that's a great idea. And, you know, those are just like a tube. It's a tube. So you can use a PVC tube, or you could just use like a reed, you know, one of those, and you put them here and there.
It's an easy project with the kids.
Oh, it'd be great.
Different sizes bamboo tubes.
Yep.
Put up in a wall and just set it everywhere.
And you just kind of glue them together in a cluster.
Allergic to bee stings.
Yeah.
Bee stings, of course.
Right. Yeah, so you can hear like, oh yeah, we got to deal with the liability issues.
They would get started if they would go close to the view. But it's like a nice way to have several kinds.
And they can be far, they don't like come too close. And you don't have to engage with them, right? So the chance of stinging is actually not that big. Right.
And you just provide them a home. You know? Monkeys will definitely stay away from
Ah.
They're doing that for coffee plantations. I grow coffee, so.
Really? And you could put the bee.
They're doing in certain areas because of the elephants.
Oh,
They're setting up bees.
interesting.
But then again, if the elephant comes at night, the bee's sleeping.
Exactly. The bee's not out and about. That's right. That's right.
commercialization, right?
I'm going to jump in. We're a little bit beyond time.
Oh, yeah, I imagine.
One last question, kind of piggybacking on what Jamal was saying, is I think a lot of what you're doing here is definitely going to inform future policy and future projects. But one thing we really hope to imbibe with what we're doing at CFI with our students is inspiring them to be able to know that, yes, I am 16, 15, 13, but I can still work towards
Absolutely.
being a change maker.
Yeah.
And so what do you think, like how can students
engage with this and work towards contributing to this. Like you've given some great examples of simply taking pictures of bees on flowers to build into the research. Jamal had a great idea, but do you have any other ideas of how young people can work towards contributing to this?
So I think just getting involved in understanding the bees is one bit, right? I mean, we're talking about just students coming to see and understand this. But I also think about, at least what I know of some of the stuff, like even with the Center for Civic and, that's not what it's called here, but the Community Engagement Center. Like there's partnerships that Woodstock has with other schools, right? And it would be cool if Woodstock students were actually even, working with students in other schools to do this kind of stuff. And like you could even collect kind of information and they could sort of see what's going on here versus here. So that kind of working with some of the other communities that Woodstock sort of engages with, I think could be interesting. I think a lot with school kids, and it's not a group that I've like spent my career sort of working with. My kids kind of passed through that age, but the thinking of so much of it is like developing that commitment, right? Developing that, beginning to understand that importance of pollinators and sort of what can I do? Why is this important to me? And sort of what can I do to enhance not just through beekeeping and honey, but like thinking more broadly about like all these different kinds of bees and these indigenous bees and sort of what are they doing in this environment and what can I do to sort of enhance pollinator health, I guess, right? What can I do? And just the bee houses, the paying attention to them and like, I remember when we were getting the tour and I can't remember, Antonio was taking us by the greenhouse and he said, now if you want to see bees, because he learned we were going to do, just go in there, right? But it's like, well, if that's where their bees are, then like, who's in there? Like who's in there and what are they doing? And just being attentive, I think like that develops, it seems to me, kind of, that's how I think you get committed to something, right? And begin to think about then what path do I want to take to sort of be that change maker? Like and also kind of what lens do I want to engage the world through, right? And you think of like going on to college and these different disciplines and, what way do I want to, how do I want to do this? Yeah? Is that helpful? Thanks. Thank you guys.
We do have a few snacks and tea outside if any of you are getting quite hungry. I just wanted to thank Kiran for taking time to visit us and share her expertise with us. I'm sure a lot more questions are on the tips of our tongues, and we can connect with her over the next little while and maybe exchange information. But
sure.
Thank you so much again for sharing this and the complexities of